Hey everyone, today let's discuss about what is DataOps. In a high-level overview, DataOps is just DevOps for data analytics. And I understand that not a lot of you have heard about DevOps in the past, so in this lesson, I'll explain about both DevOps as well as DataOps. So to get started, let us paint a picture of a real-world example. Let's say you're building a ride-sharing startup or a ride-sharing platform. To build such a platform, you need to recruit a bunch of software engineers to work on the code base. And one question that immediately comes up is, how do you build a single platform with multiple software engineers working together? In this scenario, a common approach is you'd want all of your software engineers to use a common shared repository. You can think of a repository as just a folder where all of your code is put in, and your software engineers would be working on the common shared repository using agile principles. That is, you would want your product to be built in an iterative manner where small batches of the product's version are created in each iteration. Typically, software engineer 1 would be working on one feature, software engineer 2 would be working on another feature, and software engineer N would be working on similarly another feature as well. So all of these software engineers would be building different parts of your ride-sharing platform, and you'd want to merge all of the code inside of a single folder, which we call a repository. So in the real world, we have places or platforms like GitHub, GitLab or Bitbucket where they provide a common shared repository where software engineers can push their code into. But how do you ensure that all of the code inside of the repositories are actually working and they can be deployed into production? That is, the real world users can start using your ride sharing platform. So without DevOps, the usual route would be you would manually build, test and deploy the code inside of the repository. So this would mean every time a developer or a software engineer makes some changes to the code, you will pull the code from the repository, you'll build it, you'll test it, and then once if everything is working, you'll deploy the code into your production environment. But with DevOps, the scenario gets a lot easier. So here we have a typical DevOps pipeline. So as before, we have Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab, which is our shared repository, but with DevOps, we would be building, testing and deploying our code inside of these repositories themselves. And this is called continuous integration and continuous delivery. So let us talk about all of the parts of these pipelines one by one. So first, as we've discussed before, the software engineer will develop the code. And once they've developed it, they'll push the code into the repository. And once the code has been pushed into the repository, a build script would build the environment for the code to run on. So that would be installing the required libraries, installing the required environment variables, and so on. So once the environment has been built, a series of tests will now run on the code that has just been pushed, along with all of the code that is present in the repository from before. So a test would look something like checking if the correct data types are being passed into a function or not, are the required libraries being imported in the scripts or the files of the code base, and so on. So once the build and test has been done, which is the continuous integration, then the code after passing all of the tests will be deployed to production, and this is continuous delivery. So each time a developer or a software engineer pushes code into the repository, build, test and deploy will run. That means first the code will be checked if it's actually working or not, which is continuous integration. And then if it's working, the deployment to production will happen, which is continuous delivery. And finally, once the platform or the code base has been deployed, it will be run on the actual real world, which may be just an app on the phone or a website on the internet. So this is how DevOps makes it easier for software engineers to deploy the code into production without you having to manually build, test and deploy the code. And you can understand that your software engineers are also responsible for their own code. That means if there are some errors within the test, then the software engineer would fix those tests by themselves and again push the code inside of the repository. Now, building off of this knowledge of DevOps, let us talk about what DataOps is. So for DataOps, you can imagine a scenario where you would want to build a single data analytics platform with multiple data professionals working on the platform. So before, you were trying to build a ride-sharing platform with multiple software engineers, and now you're trying to build a data analytics platform with multiple data professionals. So in this scenario, the DataOps pipeline would look like this. First, you would have a sandbox environment where a data professional would have all of the libraries already installed. It would be like a virtual environment where the data professional can work on the data. So once they understand what needs to be done, they develop the actual code for the data. So in this part, the development process of the actual code base for the data analytics platform takes place. Then, this is something new. Inside of a shared repository, we'd want to orchestrate a bunch of commands. So to understand what orchestration is, let us take this example. So here we have a direct acyclic graph that goes from point A to point B. So when node A is executed, we would fetch data from external sources inside of the repository. So that would be AWS S3, Google Cloud Storage, and so on. And when node B is executed, we'd perform data transformations using the fetched data. So in a way, we're building a data set for our code base to actually check if it's working or not. So in this case, once the orchestration has been done, we'll check the new code that has been pushed inside of the repository with the data that has been pulled. And in this way, we can actually test our code base with the data source that we want. And this is where continuous integration happens. So every time a developer pushes the code inside of a common shared repository, in this case, we'll fetch the data that we need and we'll test it against the code base. So if everything is working fine, we'll just deploy the code into production, and this would be continuous delivery. And as a second last step, we'd again have an orchestration. So after the deployment is done, the orchestration phase is where we check if the data that is coming out of the code base as an output is actually correct or not. And finally, we'd monitor all of the things that are happening in our data analytics platform. So we're just monitoring the platform if it's working or not, we're conducting tests, and if anything doesn't work as expected, we would either go back to the sandbox stage or the develop stage. And this is how you'll be using DataOps in a real-world environment. So by now you understand that DataOps brings everyone together. We have the data analytics team working on the actual analysis part, the data engineering team working on the ETL process, the data modeling team building models off of the data, and our operations team or the product team, which was previously responsible for orchestrating, testing, and deploying the entire code base. So with DataOps, we can automate all of that. I hope you now have a very good idea about what DevOps and DataOps is. If you have any questions, just write to us in the comments and I'll make sure to reply back to you. And if you would like to stick around for more content like this, please make sure to subscribe. So that's it for now. I'll see you next time.